We will wait and start.
I'll let you know what's happening. At the earliest we can. Oh, it's fine. You get off early. You get off.
Yeah. There we go.
I don't know all the way down. Yeah, you do. And you're also so nice. See, that's another nice thing about that. Not that you're such a girl. Like those wireless. They're not even less time. We're carrying on this No, we're out. Is that all good? Yeah.
Oh, I'm yeah.
The sunset.
Yeah.
No. You get off.
It goes all the way
Goes down to the beach.
Oh.
The end of the beach.
There were tons of help.
Across the street from each other.
What a community. Yeah, that's the idea. Real estate.
We're just following rules. Yeah.
I think there's just someone in the bathroom.
What's that?
There's someone in the bathroom. I'm just gonna wait until.
Oh. Yeah.
But we can get started. That's all right. They'll just have to. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
My name is Laurel. I'm the assistant manager at Green Apple Books on the Park. Thank you for coming. Let's please welcome Gary Krist and Woody LaBounty. Well, welcome. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please take this moment to silence your cell phones. And pictures are okay, but if you could, turn the sound off, that would be great. And just a little plug for the bookstore. Please come to our events. Please buy books. We have events 2 to 3 times a week, and then we have a really great lineup this spring. And by buying books, you not only support events like this, but also the authors who work so hard on their art, and you really just contribute to the community that we've built. So first we are going to just hear a little conversation between Gary and Woody. Gary will do a reading, and then we will follow up with audience questions. And a little bit about our guests here. Woody LaBounty leads nonprofit initiatives in San Francisco and is a researcher, writer, and speaker on the city's history. He serves as president and CEO of San Francisco Heritage, a 50-year-old nonprofit with a mission to protect and enhance San Francisco's unique architectural and cultural identity. Before joining Heritage, Woody was the longtime executive director of the local history organization Western Neighborhoods Project. There he led efforts to save relief cottages from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, bring more than 50,000 historical images online, and use arts and history to equitably enrich neighborhoods. Let's give Woody another welcome. And Gary Krist is the author of 4 previous narrative nonfiction books: The White Cascade, City of Scoundrels, Empire of Sin, and The Mirage Factory. He has also written 3 novels and 2 short story collections. A widely published journalist and book reviewer, Krist has been the recipient of the Stephen Crane Award, the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Lowell Thomas Gold Medal for Travel Journalism, a Fiction Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, and a Public Scholar Grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. His latest book, Trespassers at the Golden Gate, a true account of love, murder, and madness in Gilded-Age San Francisco, is the reason we are here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Gary Krist.
Thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you, Gary, for coming out to San Francisco and
Absolutely.
being with us, and for writing this wonderful book, which I really enjoyed reading. I'm going to try to dole out my compliments throughout the evening.
Okay.
But
I'll take as many as you can.
but it was just a really entertaining book. And for me, a person who grew up in San Francisco and is very steeped in its history, it was also very educational, which is just an amazing thing. So let's talk a little bit about how we got to this book, a little bit of background. So I know you wrote about Chicago, New Orleans, Los Angeles. How did you go from these cities to San Francisco?
Well, for about the last 15 years or so, I've been on this kind of personal project, writing what I call these city narratives, which are essentially books where I try to tell the larger story of a particular American city. Usually at some key transitional stage when it goes from being kind of a backwater to being a place of some substance. And I try to convey that transition through the personal stories of a limited number of individuals. Sometimes they're famous people, sometimes they're semi-famous. I would say that these people are semi-famous. Sometimes they're not famous at all. And I started with Chicago because I wanted to do the sort of quintessential big industrial city of immigrants. And I wrote a book called City of Scoundrels in 2012. And then I thought, well, I've done the typical big industrial city. What is the most unusual American city? And so I went down to New Orleans, and in 2014 I published a book called Empire of Sin. And most recently I wanted to do another unusual city. So I went to Los Angeles with the Mirage Factory in 2018. That was a city that grew up in a place that was a little counterintuitive for a big city grew up in that place. And so after I did Los Angeles, I said, well, I've got to do Los Angeles' perennial rival, San Francisco. I mean, San Francisco got a big jump in the growth sweepstakes because of the gold rush, and so grew much bigger, much faster. But then Los Angeles kind of caught up and exceeded it in the early 20th century. And I was also just really fascinated by the entirely different ethoses of the two cities. I mean, such that people say you've got to be either an LA person or a San Francisco person. I'm just trying to explore different ways of being urban.
Right. And just for people who haven't read your previous books or kind of know how you do this, it's not just that the characters and the event that this book describes is key to it, but the city is a hero too. The city is a protagonist in a way, correct?
Right. Yeah. And each one, there are certain common themes that seem to crop up again and again, but each one ultimately has a totally different personality.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit? Is this a good time to talk a little bit about the sort of central event that drives this book? And can you tell us a little bit about it? And without too many spoilers.
The personal narrative that I'm foregrounding, against the background of the changing city, in this case, is kind of a classic true crime story about one of the most sensational murders in San Francisco history. In November of 1870, a young, beautiful, already somewhat notorious woman named Laura D. Fair guns down her longtime adulterous lover, whose name was A.P. Crittenden, right on a crowded ferry that was going from Oakland to San Francisco, and right in front of the victim's wife and two of his children. So the crime itself could hardly be any more brazen and scandalous. And the victim was a fairly well-known San Francisco attorney and California politician. So it was bound to, the trial was bound to create a certain level of feverish interest, at least locally and regionally. But there were several elements to it that really made it blow up to a nationwide sensation. And it was a media circus that ultimately brought in major figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Horace Greeley, even Mark Twain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember, I just want to read something that you kind of talked about there. So you make a sort of interesting connection to me. You say, ultimately, the trial of Laura Fair would prove to be deeply controversial, provoking bitter debate nationwide and challenging long-held beliefs of a populace still searching for moral consensus after the shattering disruption of the Civil War. So, it was really interesting how you could take this one event and really tie it to what the city was going through and its sort of growth, and it's trying to create its own identity, I guess, in those years between the gold rush and the 1870s. Can you talk more about kind of how you make those sort of broader connections, or did they come quickly?
Well, there are kind of two levels here too. It reflected certain national tendencies, but there was also something very specific to San Francisco. And the national tendencies, the trial really touched on some hot button social issues of the day, issues that challenged traditional beliefs about things like the proper role of women in the public sphere, if any, the sanctity of marriage and the family, what you might call the range of socially acceptable expressions of femininity, by which I mean, if you're a respectable woman, these are the things you can do, these are the things you can't do if you want to remain respectable. And all of these things were changing in the years after the Civil War, because if you think of it, during the Civil War, a lot of women had been forced to perform traditionally male functions, since all of their males, their fathers, husbands, brothers, were off fighting in the war, and many had proved quite capable at it, indeed. So after the war, a lot of these women were determined not to go back to the old days of subservience and total domesticity. They wanted to vote. They wanted to own property separate from their husbands. They wanted to run businesses. They wanted to be out in the world doing things. And this was really perceived as a threat by a lot of men, certainly, but also by a lot of women. It was considered an attack on the basic building block of the stable Victorian society, which is this family where it's the man who's facing the world and doing things, and the woman's realm is purely hearth and home. So it really reflected those things that were going on after the Civil War. But there was something specific to San Francisco that was also brought into play, and that is, in 1870, San Francisco was really still in the process of trying to rid itself of this reputation from the Gold Rush era as a kind of socially chaotic, wild, lawless, louche city where anything goes. I mean, the Transcontinental Railroad had just come to town the year before, in 1869. And that had brought the city into much closer contact with the mainstream of American culture and ways of thinking. So there was a whole cadre of, I call them community elites, sort of the lawyers, the politicians, the business people, who were really trying to sell this idea of San Francisco as a business-like, law-abiding, stable city where you could invest your money. And so they really wanted to make an example of, Laura Fair. Only a guilty verdict and a death sentence would send the right message that they wanted to send to the world, and particularly to the Eastern bankers and financiers whose investments the city needed to keep growing. And that message was, the Wild West is over, long gone in San Francisco, and the kind of violence and depravity represented by Laura Fair, not just her crime, but even who she was, how she lived her life, that is not going to be tolerated anymore. So there was a lot hanging on this trial.
Yeah, and you did a great job. I mean, I do feel like the role of women and the strictures they faced and the changing times, and conversely, it goes from being they have more rights, they have more latitude and agency, and then they have less. It's not this progression to somehow more women's rights. And that you really do a great job of showing how other women who maybe aren't directly involved in this story are part of San Francisco's scene in the early days. Mary Ellen Pleasant, a prominent African-American entrepreneur, Atoy. These are people who you're bringing into the story and kind of showing how women's roles and the roles of people who aren't white and who aren't men change, and how the way the society looks at them is reflected in the trial. And I thought that was pretty interesting how you kind of brought that in.
Right. I think of those as the trespassers of the title, and I mean it as a compliment. But there is this kind of cast of other characters that I also follow, who, like Laura Fair, don't fit comfortably into these Victorian categories. They are like mostly women who go beyond the roles that are imposed on them, and not just by killing their lovers and things like that. No, but just by being business people, or like Mary Ann Pleasant was somebody who came in 52, I think she came, and she managed to assemble an enormous amount of power and influence and wealth, and that was considered threatening.
She's a woman, and she's African American.
Right. Yeah. I mean, neither women nor African Americans are supposed to have power and money in this society. So all of these people had to be kind of marginalized in a way, and so I think Mary Ellen Pleasant became in the public mind Mammy Pleasant, a name that she hated, but that was how so many people referred to her. And these tales that she was a voodoo woman, and that's how she had her disturbing success through spells and potions and things like that. So there was this real effort to marginalize anybody who didn't fit this paradigm.
Yeah, you do talk about the title Trespassers. These are people who dare to sort of step out of the box that people want to put them in.
Right.
And Laura Fair in this trial is sort of a spark about all these stories, because she exemplifies stepping out of the box and doing something.
Right.
I just want to you kind of made me think of something. I'm going to throw another quote in here. You talk about how in the early days of the gold rush in San Francisco, I'll just quote this. Since San Francisco was still utterly isolated, with no rapid mail, telegraph, or railroad connections to the rest of the country, all that was required to start over again as a new and different person was a plausible story. And I kind of wonder, as a historian and a researcher, when you start digging into an era and a place where a plausible story was all that was needed to write your own history, how do you find sort of the truth and a sense of certainty in your story and the research? It must be really daunting.
Well, yeah, you always have to apply kind of reasonableness standards and just really dig dig deeply. But my favorite story about reinventing oneself in California was this guy named Talbot Green, who came out. I think he came out in the 40s, and he was very popular guy, and he decided that he was going to run for mayor. And only after he did that did people find out that his real name was Paul Geddes, that he had abandoned a wife and children in Philadelphia and embezzled money from the bank he worked for. And if he hadn't run for mayor, he would have gotten away with it, because there was just no easy connection between Philadelphia and San Francisco in those days. So, you really could say anything about yourself. Mm-hmm. And so there was also a lot of racial passing going on, and all kinds of, you could just reinvent yourself as something, which was a kind of wonderful thing.
Yeah, it was good and bad, right? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Laura Fair herself. I mean, her background and how she gets to the place she is, and how she draws the attention of people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and kind of people trying to reevaluate how a woman who, in front of all these witnesses, shoots a man on a ferry is sort of judged a little, less strictly, or just given some latitude about her circumstances.
Well, she was so badly treated by that guy, so that I kind of agreed with the one juror who was rejected for the jury, who said basically in the examination, the voir dire examinations, where they talk to prospective jurors to see whether they know anything about the case, and basically the guy said, "I think any guy who acted like Crittenden deserved to be shot," and so he was quietly excused from the jury. But she was, I don't think any of those suffragists like Susan B. Anthony were saying it's okay to kill somebody. Yeah. But they were saying, she was a strong and desperate woman who did what she had to protect herself because she was being mistreated. But there was also a lot of, she was what was known as a strong-minded woman, which was a euphemism for basically the kind of woman who was not subservient. Yeah. And so she was, she was assertive when, women were supposed to be demure. She actually seemed to enjoy sex when women were supposed to be sexless. She was an entrepreneur. She was a business person. She dabbled in mining stocks. Yeah. And she was even an actress, the worst thing of all. Right. An actor for a brief time in life. So she became a symbol of this new woman that was so threatening to a lot of conservatives.
Yeah. And they also bring out sort of the double standard because, I don't think I'm spoiling anything, they sort of go with an insanity plea, or at least that she's not in her mind when she does this. And there had been recent cases where men, find their wife with a lover or something and it shocked them and they got off. Yeah. And so it's sort of this double standard, like, wow, can a woman not feel that way?
Is the temporary insanity plea is a really interesting subject, I found. It was relatively new at this time. The first time it was used successfully was in 1859. A guy named Dan Sickles, who was a U.S. congressman from New York, he found out that his wife was carrying on with another man. The other man just happened to be the son of Francis Scott Key, the person who wrote the national anthem. Anyway, he shot Key down in Lafayette Park, right across from the White House, and he went to trial, but he was acquitted, and he was acquitted on a temporary insanity plea on the basis of something that was known at the time as the unwritten law. And this was kind of an understanding that certain crimes of passion were excusable, particularly in the case of a man who finds that his wife or his daughter has been seduced, and this was allegedly such an outrageous thing, and that he could not be expected to control himself, and so he can't be responsible for his actions. And so Laura Fair's lawyers thought maybe we can use this same rationale, of course, the connection was a little weak. She was a woman. She wasn't a man. She shot her lover. She didn't shoot her rival. And, by most definitions, she was one of the adulterers, not the aggrieved party. So
Right.
it was a bit of a stretch. So they brought in some other precedents. But it was really, the question is, if this can be justification for a man to commit murder, why could it not be for a woman?
Right, and this is 1870. I mean, it still feels
Right.
very early to be
Right.
sort of making that argument, which was very interesting. I just want to really quick, I was thinking about the book this morning because I read it, like a lot of people, you get a page turner, and I was on vacation actually when I read it, and I just like went right through it, took it all in, was just like wanting to read the next chapter, and I didn't really have time for it to settle. And so this morning I was trying to think about it, and I said, how much ground did Gary cover in this book? And I just tried it off the top of my head. I wrote down like what you talk about through this trial in San Francisco over like 25 years. So, we have everything from, Gold Rush, Transcontinental Railroad, all the context and background of the mission system in California, Native American genocide, sex work and how that was going on, gambling, politics, the Civil War, the Comstock load, speculative capitalism and mining stocks, literary luminaries like Bret Harte and Mark Twain show up in here, African-American entrepreneurs, and sort of a system of institutional racism in Chinese and African-American. But you really get into this. It's not just like a little bit. The California legal system in the early 1850s, social mores, plus all of this with the trial, these characters, the family, their backgrounds. And I just kind of wonder, all this in like 314 pages. And I was, of course, just eating it all up. But how do you, as a writer and a researcher and an editor, how do you kind of go through what you're keeping and what you're not? Because it must have been a massive amount of research you did.
There's always so much more than I can possibly use. And I mean, one of the things I love about cities is that they involve everything. They so many different kinds of people, so many different kinds of situations are brought together, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to convey. In these city books, how everything is interconnected. But you got to have a story. You got to have, you can't overwhelm people. So it really is the main challenge I face is how to corral all of this information into a readable narrative. And many things wind up on the cutting room floor, like the Vigilance Committee episodes. These were episodes where basically vigilantes took over San Francisco for several months and just took all the power away from the elected government and just ran the whole town by themselves. And it's a very complex story. Crittenden was actually tangentially involved in the second one, but there was, first of all, so much had been written about it already,
right?
And I just felt if I'm going to go deeply into it, I'll just get lost in that morass of detail. So I dealt pretty briefly with it. But,
well, when you were in LA, when you were writing the LA book, and you were like, okay, it's time to go to the better city, San Francisco. Did you? What was your entry into it? Was it like you're going to find, like, we've had great trials here, right? We've had the vigilantes, came from James King and William, get shot in the street in the 1850s. Right. We have Fatty Arbuckle, getting caught with a dead woman.
I considered writing that book, but other books have been written about that.
Yeah.
So,
He's a Hollywood actor, very famous Hollywood comedian in the 1920s, and in St. Francis Hotel, a young woman he's accused of raping and killing her. And so ruins his reputation, but it's great. 3 trials. It's a great story. Of course, we have in a lot of people's here living memory. We have Dan White, the supervisor, shooting Harvey Milk and the mayor, and his Twinkie defense and other sort of. Right. So I guess I wonder how, when you decide Gary Krist is going to San Francisco, what's your entry? Is it a time? Is it a place? You kind of talk about transitions, I guess.
Yeah, I do tend to focus on these times when a town goes from being kind of nowhere to being somewhere. Mm-hmm. So, and that happened much earlier in San Francisco than it did in LA. So I was going to be dealing with different time periods, and then, but I do pick the city and the time period first, and then start reading voraciously and try to decide, well, what personal story will allow me to get at all of those issues. And one of the things that people might not think about, it's like it can't just be a compelling and dramatic story. I mean, I do look for compelling and dramatic stories because I try not to bore people. But even the most compelling and dramatic storyline is really just going to remain a kind of sketchy plot summary unless I can bring it to life on the page with kind of novelistic elements. Things like real dialogue, scenes in which people are coming into conflict or a confrontation, vivid descriptions and things like that. But I'm a nonfiction writer, so I can't make it up. I can't invent it.
Right.
So I've got to find that kind of material in the existing historical record, in things like memoirs or court transcripts, letters and newspaper interviews and things like that. If I can't get that kind of material in abundance, I can't use the story, no matter how amazing it may seem in summary. But fortunately for this story, I had probably a richer abundance of that kind of material than I've ever had in my career.
I was very jealous because it seemed like you were finding a lot of letters. It seemed like a lot of correspondence, and I was curious how you found like a gold mine of letters from her talking.
Oh boy, I had letters. But I mean, first of all, I had the court transcript, which there were actually 2 trials. I don't want to give too much away, but the official transcripts seem to be no longer extant. I have a feeling that they were destroyed in the 1906.
We had a big fire.
I remember hearing something about
in
that.
1906.
But such was the interest in this trial at the time that the 2 court stenographers actually commercially published a verbatim transcript that was sold in bookstores. And it contained, this was a month-long trial, so it was hundreds and hundreds of pages of sometimes juicy testimony. So I had all that to draw on. And then the letters. I mean, first of all, there were scores of letters of kind of intimate, very embarrassing love letters between Crittenden and Fair that were admitted as evidence in the trial. And so they were reprinted with the court transcript. They were also reprinted as the trial was going on. They were being reprinted in 2 of the daily newspapers, which everybody was reading. And I'm sure poor Clara Crittenden was probably totally mortified by
the
that.
wife. Yes.
And then I found in an online database, I found an exchange of letters between Crittenden and his wife, between A.P. and Clara, about the death of their son in the Civil War. He was actually executed in the field in Virginia as a Confederate spy. And this was in a collection of letters about the Civil War in the University of Washington's online collection. But the real motherlode was the Crittenden Family Papers, which is housed at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan, which was basically one of Crittenden's daughters collected hundreds and hundreds of letters to and from the Crittenden parents, the Crittenden children, the Crittenden aunts and uncles and distant cousins, all of them talking about what was going on in the family. And so there were certain times for A.P. Crittenden in particular where I felt like I knew what he was doing on an almost daily basis.
Right. And what they thought about what he was doing, which I thought was interesting. Yeah.
And I loved being able to compare letters from different collections. So from the trial letters, there would be a letter from Crittenden to Fair, and from the other collection, there would be a letter from Crittenden to his wife from about the same time. And he was telling them
totally
2 different things, and they were both lies.
Yes.
So I just felt like, it's 150 years later, but I got you. I know what you were doing.
We've got you, yeah. I mean, the thing, when you read this book, you're going to love this because the letters really put you in the mindset and sort of the relationship that is happening in mid-19th century. I think we don't think of people being the same. In some way, we see their letters or what's printed in the newspaper or in a book. but to see the love that they express for each other, to see her sort of talking about, feeling like she is his wife in spirit, and even if it's not in law, and he seems like a manic depressive to me. I gotta say, he's like heights of love and then despondent, and I have no money and I'm going to be rich, but these characters are really engaging just through their own words. So it was a lot of fun for me, I felt.
No, and you can find added dimensions. Like there's a series of letters where Clara Crittenden came from a very religious family, and she and several of the children were very worried about AP because he didn't believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
And they were really worried that he was going to die and that they were going to not see him in heaven. And there are these, heartfelt things between husband and wife where he says, I would like to believe, but I can't believe. And so I think you really get extra dimensions to the character when you have that kind of access to their...
Yeah, it was really fun. I mean, I really did feel like these characters came to life where I just thought, 1850s, 1860s, how much are you going to be able to dig up, really? But they really did come to life. It was exciting. I also want to just quickly say, and I'll let you get a glass of water there too, because I know I've been having you talk too much. I finished the book and I wasn't sure. I was like, who's the hero here? What's the protagonist? At the end, am I going to be like Laura Fair? Laura Fair is my gal, right? Or is it Crittenden was done wrong? Or Clara Crittenden? Or was Justice? I didn't know where I was going to land. And in the end, I did feel like San Francisco was the hero, in a sense, or the protagonist. And that you use these real people and what they went through to tell the story of San Francisco. And I guess it's the transition between sort of gold rush, anything goes, to sort of now we're, going to be a Victorian metropolis. We're going to adhere to the social strictures. Do you feel like there's any lessons for San Francisco or a city today, or is it just that moment of time when a city matures that is there?
Well, I think there has always been this sort of struggle between progressive and conservative elements, certainly in every city, but even in San Francisco. But somehow I think despite all of that, there lingers in this city a certain kind of tolerance of difference and eccentricity and just not conforming that lingers, even though there have also been these conservative elements that have tried to clamp down on it, and this was one instance, but you could probably come up with others in later decades. But somehow San Francisco always manages to have this kind of tolerance of eccentricity, nonconformism that lasts, I think, until today.
And do you find that with the other cities when you wrote those books? Is there some element of character that continues in the city?
I think so. I think the rebelliousness of New Orleans. I do think that the early. What is that saying, that you find the adult in the child or something like that? But I do think that there's a certain element of each city's original personality that persists even through modern days.
That's kind of neat and a little comforting to me too. Yeah. I kind of feel like I like that. I just want to read another quote real quick that I don't know, spoke to me, even though you probably didn't mean it the way I'm thinking of it. Crittenden writes during the vigilante era of 1856, which he sees, and the vigilantes have taken over the city. I am utterly heartsick at what I have seen here. My faith in Republican institutions and in man's capacity for self-government is shaken. And I kind of feel like that today.
Oh, yes.
And I just kind of wonder, again, I kind of felt like when I read this, I'm like, well, there's always these tides, these uncertainties and fears and the way people see the cities, but then things change again, and I guess I came out of that.
No, I was just going to say that, sometimes people ask me, well, what do you want people to take away from your books? And one of the things I say is that, we have been through horrible, horrible times. Somehow we've gotten through it. So, take heart. But these days I'm like, will we get through it? I don't know.
No, we will. No, we will.
I don't know.
Where's the next city? Where are you going next, Gary? Literally,
Well,
or literally.
It's still very early. I mean, this book is just out, but people have always asked me, you know, you've spent most of your life in and around New York City. Why don't you write something about New York
That's
City?
a small subject, right?
Yeah.
You can kind of handle that.
But for one thing, I wouldn't have to travel to do the research. So what fun is that? I mean, my wife always accuses me of choosing the cities I write about based on the restaurants. And I can't deny that entirely. But I think there's something about Greenwich Village that I want to write, but it's still too early to talk about.
You heard it here first, but it's still too early to talk about. Would you like to read some of your book here?
Do we have time?
We
for
do.
that?
We certainly do.
It's just a short section to kind of show how when you have the material like the court transcripts and stuff like that, how you can really write a kind of novelistic scene. Now, this is one of the more operatic scenes from the book. It's the final confrontation between Clara Crittenden and Laura Fair. We haven't talked so much about the story, but basically they were enemies, obviously. They had several meetings before where Clara was still trying to pretend that she didn't believe the rumors that her husband was having an affair with this woman. And their testimony on some of these scenes was pretty different. As a matter of fact, there was one instance where Clara Crittenden is on the stage on the stand describing what happened, and Laura Fair stood up and said, "That's a lie," as if it were like
Judge Judy or something.
Yeah. She was actually fined $250 for contempt of court for that. But in this scene, they actually agreed. All of the testimony agreed. So I'm just going to read this now. It's a short scene. Laura has just come back from an extended trip to the east. This was one of the times when AP had been promising that he was going to divorce Clara and go east with Laura and get married to her. Again, he broke that promise, and so Laura came back to San Francisco. It's the first part of a chapter called Wife versus Wife. Clara came to her on the Sunday after Laura's return to San Francisco, during the church hour, when few people with their prying eyes would be out on the streets. Late in the morning, Mrs. Hammersmith informed her tenant that there was a woman downstairs who wished to see her. Laura knew exactly who it must be. AP had warned her that Clara would be coming and urged her to be honest. "Tell her the truth," he'd said. There was no reason to maintain the charade any longer. So when Clara was shown inside and without preamble asked why Laura had come back to California, the younger woman held nothing back. Mr. Crittenden, she told Clara, was by his own admission dying without her. He'd said he couldn't concentrate or accomplish anything toward his goals while she was away. He'd written and even telegraphed her in New York to beg her to return. Clara did not want to hear this. "If only you had stayed away," she responded. "It would have given her, his legal wife, an opportunity to win him back, to recall him to his sense of decency and loyalty to his family." This, of course, was hardly a line of argument that would persuade her rival to cede the field. So Clara began outright pleading with Laura to go away again. She insisted that it was Laura's duty, quote, "as a woman and as a mother, for the sake of her child, whom she was bringing to shame and ruin, and for her own name, and for the sake of his children, and for the sake of his home, not to lead him to shame and ruin." This lecture on her womanly duty apparently got Laura's much celebrated dander up, and she grew more heated in her reply. "I told her that he loved me and I loved him, and that he did not love her, Clara, and that he was more my husband than he was hers." When Clara pointed out that Laura was committing adultery, regardless of Mr. Crittenden's feelings, she shocked the older woman by saying that it was Clara who was the adulteress, for she was not truly his wife. "This, of course, startled me considerably," Clara later testified, "as I had been taught that when I vowed to love, honor, and obey till death do us part, I thought that I was doing my duty." But Laura was just getting started. She said that she would never leave Crittenden unless he himself told her to, that he had even made her promise never to go unless and until he specifically requested it. If he did, despite or because of her intense love for him, she would give him up and disappear forever from his life. But of course, Clara knew her husband and his weaknesses better than anyone. She understood that AP could never bring himself to say the word and let Laura go, that whether he wanted to or not, he could not say it. That's why Laura had to be the one to break it off. But this Laura refused to do. And when she said that Clara should instead sue her husband for divorce, Clara became even more upset. She went on to tell me that she would never give him a divorce, Laura testified, and that he never should marry me while she lived, that she would rather see him die at her feet. Those were her words exactly, that she would see him die at her feet before he should marry me. That's when Laura thrust her sharpest dagger to her rival's heart, contending that Clara's own words proved whose love for Crittenden was really genuine. For she, Laura, would gladly let him go if that was what would make him happy. This, Laura insisted, proved that her love was true and Clara's was not. Mrs. Crittenden did not care for that, Laura claimed, and she got very excited and told me that she would fight his ever getting a divorce forever, even if both of them died. And at this point, Clara, by her own admission, stormed out of the lodging house uttering a solemn vow. I will never sue for a divorce, so help me God. This would be the last time the two women ever spoke. Although they would occasionally see each other on the street over the next 2 years, and again, of course, aboard the Oakland ferry on that evening of November 3rd, 1870, each would refuse to address the other directly. There would be no further offerings of sisterly advice. That was a reference to earlier times when Clara was pretending she didn't believe the rumors, and she would offer Laura sisterly advice about perhaps, not hanging around her husband so long, so much. But anyway.
I think maybe we should take some questions from the audience. Yes, go ahead.
I have a question. Does your historical analysis lead you to the conclusion that not only were the police notoriously corrupt, but that the legal system and lawyers at the time were corrupt and could perhaps be led to be bribed?
I'll repeat the question. So he asked, did Gary's research lead him to believe that not only the police might be corrupt, but that the legal system itself could be corrupt and that bribery could have happened in this case?
There was a big worry that the jury was going to be bribed. The criminal justice system at this time and the police at this time were very much, has it changed? I don't know. Very much at the service of the moneyed people, So, I don't think it was necessarily necessary to bribe a judge, because a judge was naturally going to decide things sort of in the favor of the respectable, rich establishment. I do think the police were probably accepting money, and certainly there are all kinds of stories that we didn't talk so much about about Mark Twain, but Mark Twain had a thing about the San Francisco police, and he once quit a job because he saw two Irish workers beating up a Chinese man, and two cops were just like watching and doing nothing. And so he wrote this editorial for the San Francisco Call, and the editors of the San Francisco Call refused to print it because they were afraid of alienating their Irish readers. And so Twain was so demoralized that he quit that job. So I think, the police certainly, the criminal justice system, the influence and bribery was a little bit more subtle, I think.
And the juries were all men at this time.
Yeah.
That's
that was another thing that, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was saying. It's like, it's supposed to be a jury of her peers, but they're all men.
Yeah.
There are no women on that jury.
Right. Other questions? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your research process? Do you come to the cities? How often How long does it take?
So the question is asking Gary what his research process is. Does he come to the city? How many trips? Where do you eat?
Oh, that I can tell all night. I do come to the city frequently, usually for like 2-week stretches. You know, even in the amount of time that I've been writing these books, so much more is available online. So that, you know, when I was writing the Chicago book, there were certain things I really had to go to Chicago to find. Most of the stuff I needed, I could find online this time, but I still feel you've got to go to the city. Even if the city does not look at all the way it did 150 years ago, you have to go, you have to be on the streets, you've got to, you know, walk up and down the hills and just feel what it's like. I mean, I'm not a very spiritual person, but I do think that there is some kind of continuity that you can sense when you're in a city and you can feel its past.
Just the weather, I guess, right?
Well,
Just
that's
sort of get that feeling, yeah. Other questions? Yes.
I'm curious, since you do so much research, how do you keep it all organized? Like, it's like your note-taking system.
Yes, I'm curious about this too. She asked, since he does so much research, and by the way, how long did it take? How many years went into this?
This was a long one because of the pandemic.
Okay,
For instance, the Clements Library that had the papers, the Crittenden family papers, was closed for 1.5 years, and then when they reopened, they were only open for members of the University of Michigan community, so I had to wait another 6 months.
Or enroll at the University of Michigan.
Yeah, really, which would have been a little expensive, but they said that I was first on the list of outsiders to get in.
The question was, how do you keep organized, right? You do all this research. What is your system? Is he organized?
Yeah. I'm a little more digital these days than I used to be, but I take hand notes and I sort of rearrange them in files, and then I say, oh, that's not right, and I rearrange them in other files. But somebody has just introduced me to Zotero and things like that, so I'm trying not to be so much of a Luddite, but it really is, my process is disturbingly analog. And sometimes the thing that drives me crazy is I will remember a quote and I will say, where was that quote? And I will go through all of my notes and I cannot find that quote. And sometimes it'll take me 2 days to find a quote.
Been there. No. And I think, I don't know, I'm getting older too, so I'm just like, did I make that up? Did I just like make that quote up?
Right,
yeah. Other questions? Anybody have any questions about San Francisco? Well, you know, we didn't talk too much about the story because I didn't want to spoil anything.
Right.
But is there any, you know, you can ask also general questions about the era. Gary has done too many years researching it, so yeah. Yes.
I'm curious because I just read a book about Gumps, about the old store. Is there anything? Do you have anything that came up in that timeline that you were writing about?
So the question is, there was an old department store, there's a department store, Gumps, in the city that's very famous. And I guess the question is, the mercantile environment of San Francisco, famous stores, and how deep do you get in?
Yeah, I mean, I was interested to see what companies were sort of engendered by the gold rush, like Levi Strauss, and what's the name of the bank? Wells Fargo.
Bank of California, you know.
Well, the Bank of California,
goes down,
Yeah, that was, another person we didn't talk about was Ralston, who, you know, really was important in the making of the city. But I didn't get too much into the department stores or things like that. But it's just interesting to see how. Oh, one more question. So,
Oh, yeah.
okay.
Yeah, you're good. You can finish this.
No, all right. I have nothing more to say.
Okay. Last question. Yes.
I'm curious how the children were involved in the case and what happened to them afterwards.
Right. So, well, the question is, he's curious about the children that were involved in the case and what happened after the case. And we didn't say Laura Fair had a child from previous marriage also, including. So there's also 2 sets of children. So, yeah.
There was a big split between the male Crittenden children and the female Crittenden children. Crittenden really let his older sons in on the secret, and some of them actually came to live with them when he was living with Laura Fair, and one of them actually fell in love with Laura Fair and wrote her a mash note that was so explicit that Laura took it to AP and said, "Look, you got to give this guy a talking to." But meanwhile, the older daughters were talking among themselves in the letters, saying, "Can you?" They called them Ma and Pa. Can you believe how badly Pa is treating Ma? You know, because he kept on. You know, she wanted to move with him when he moved up to Nevada, which is where he worked for a while, and he, of course, had Laura Fair up there, and he didn't want his wife to come up there. So he kept on saying, "Oh, there's no house suitable for you. There's no comfortable house. It's the whole town is really a wild town still." But the daughters were onto him, and so they really took sides basically. And there was after he died, there was a lot of upset about the will, and some of the sons acted abominably and like stole his law library and stuff like that. It was a screwed up family. It really was. But you know, those are the interesting ones according to Tolstoy. So
Well, thank you so much for writing this book. And I think Gary's going to be signing over there. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Take it away, Laura.
Yeah. Let's give Gary and Woody one more hand. Yeah, so Gary will be signing at the back desk, right where I was standing. There are books to purchase at the front counter, this title as well as some of Gary's other books. So please just wrap around the desk, form a line that like follows the curve of the desk, so we leave a path for people. And thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Just across the street.
Just get up and just take the end
Portal
of
the book?
Get up and
Yeah, it kind of has about the main gist of it, and then it does have it.
And you can first out to
But then they kind of talks about what happens. It's really this story, like I said, really the story of San Francisco maturing from 1849 to being kind of like
That's right.
a real city in 1860. But you see a ladder. I feel almost guilty reading all these letters and the people are